For 13 months, I was declared dead while my consciousness remained cruelly intact. I heard my husband collect my life insurance, felt the tears at my funeral, and endured the helpless horror of being trapped in my unresponsive body. David thought he'd created the perfect crime. A wife erased, replaced by a fictional patient in a long-term care facility where no one would ever find me. "You should have left it alone, Em," he had whispered at my hospital bedside. "You were always too curious for your own good." What my husband hadn't counted on was my will to survive, or that the physical therapist who noticed my subtle responses would become my lifeline back to the world, or that I would remember every word, every betrayal, every admission of guilt. They say when you take away everything from someone, you leave them with nothing to lose. David stole my life, my voice, my very existence. But as I lay there, consciousness, trapped in stillness, I made a silent vow. I would find my way back. And when I did, I wouldn't just reclaim my name. I would ensure he faced justice for every moment he left me imprisoned in my own body. The day I walked into his vow renewal ceremony would be the day David Wilson learned that the dead can rise, and that some secrets refuse to stay buried. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The champagne bubbles tickled my nose as David clinked his glass against mine. 5 years of marriage celebrated at Porter's, the upscale steakhouse where he had proposed. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the distance that had grown between us over the past few months. "To us," he said, his blue eyes not quite meeting mine. 5 years of adventure. That slight pause told me everything. Adventure wasn't the word he wanted to use. Maybe endurance. Maybe obligation. "To us," I echoed, taking a sip. The champagne tasted expensive but flat somehow, like everything in our relationship lately. David checked his phone again, the soft glow illuminating his handsome face. At 34, he still turned heads when we entered rooms, his dark hair always perfectly styled, his posture radiating the confidence that had attracted me when we first met at that charity gala. Back when I was just starting as a journalist, and he was climbing the corporate ladder at Lifewell Insurance. "Important email?" I asked, knowing it wasn't. "Just work," he muttered, sliding the phone back into his jacket pocket. "The merger is keeping everyone on edge." I nodded, deciding not to push. That's what our marriage had become, a series of not-pushing moments strung together with small talk and separate sides of the bed. The waiter arrived with our entrees, and I welcomed the distraction. The rich aroma of my medium-rare filet couldn't quite overcome the sour taste of disappointment in my mouth. 5 years ago, I would never have imagined our anniversary would feel like a business dinner. "I got a new lead today," I said, cutting into my steak. "Something big." David raised an eyebrow, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "Oh?" I hesitated, wondering how much to share. My instincts as an investigative journalist were screaming that this story could be career-defining. But my instincts as a wife were more complicated. "Novartis Pharmaceuticals," I said, watching his reaction carefully. Someone reached out about irregularities in their clinical trials, people dying in phase 3, testing of their new heart medication, and the data being buried. David's hand tightened around his fork, knuckles whitening. He set it down carefully, reaching for his water. "That's Sinclair's company," he said, after taking a long drink. "I know." Robert Sinclair was the CEO of the pharmaceutical giant that was in final negotiations to merge with Lifewell, David's employer. The merger would create a healthcare powerhouse and likely secure David the VP position he'd been angling for. "You can't pursue this, Emma," he said, his voice suddenly hard. "You know how important this merger is for my career?" I felt a flash of anger. "So I should ignore potentially criminal negligence because it might inconvenience your promotion?" "It's not just a promotion," he hissed, leaning forward. It's everything I've worked for, everything we've worked for. I don't remember agreeing to sacrifice journalistic integrity as part of our marriage vows. His eyes narrowed. Don't be dramatic. There are 1,000 other stories you could chase. Why this one? Why now? I pushed my plate away, appetite gone. Because people died, David. And more will die if this medication gets FDA approval based on falsified data. You don't know that the data was falsified. That's why it's called investigating, to find out the truth. He laughed, a hollow sound that chilled me. The truth? Please. You mean a sensational headline that will get you noticed by the nationals. The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth in it. I did want recognition. After years of solid but unremarkable reporting for the Chronicle, I craved the validation of breaking something substantial. This isn't about my ego, I insisted. Isn't it? David's voice was cool, controlled. Too controlled. Just wait 6 months, Emma. After the merger goes through, chase whatever story you want. I'll even help you. I stared at him, suddenly seeing a stranger across the table. When had we stopped supporting each other's dreams? When had compromise become surrender? I can't wait, I said quietly. My source says the FDA review is happening next month. After that, it's too late. David's jaw tightened. He signaled for the check. Our half-eaten anniversary dinner abandoned. The drive home was painfully silent. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then building to a steady downpour that matched my mood. I stared out the window, watching the city. Lights blur through the raindrops, each one a decision point, a path not taken. I don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this, David finally said as we turned onto our street. And I don't understand why you're so determined to stop me, I countered. What aren't you telling me, David? He didn't answer, just pulled into our driveway and killed the engine. We sat in silence for a moment, the rain drumming on the roof. Need some air, I said, reaching for the door handle. Emma, it's pouring. I'll take my car, drive around, clear my head. Don't be ridiculous. But I was already out, rain instantly soaking through my dress as I hurried to my sedan parked at the curb. I heard David call my name, but I didn't turn back. I needed space to think, to breathe. I slid behind the wheel, my hands trembling slightly as I started the engine. The windshield wipers pushed back the rain in rhythmic swoops, like a metronome counting beats in our disintegrating marriage. I pulled away from the curb, unsure where I was going. Maybe to Sophia's? My best friend always had room on her couch and never judged my marital troubles. Or maybe just a long drive along the coast, where the crash of waves might drown out the noise in my head. The rain intensified as I reached the intersection, waiting for the light to change. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Come home. We can talk this through. The light turned green. I pressed the accelerator, moving into the intersection. That's when I realized something was wrong. The car kept accelerating faster than I intended. I pressed the brake pedal, but nothing happened. My heart lurched as I pumped it again. Nothing. No, 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 I whispered, panic rising as I swerved to avoid a car turning left in front of me. The brake pedal went all the way to the floor. Useless. I yanked the emergency brake, but the car was moving too fast, hydroplaning on the wet pavement. Ahead, the light at the next intersection was turning red. Cars were crossing. I jerked the wheel, trying to steer into an empty parking lot, but the sedan was moving too fast. The world spun in a blur of headlights and rain. I remember screaming. The sickening crunch of metal on metal. The airbag exploding in my face with the force of a sledgehammer. Then darkness. Not the darkness of unconsciousness. Something different. I could think, could hear, could feel pain radiating throughout my body. But I couldn't move, couldn't open my eyes, couldn't speak. Voices swirled around me, urgent and professional. BP dropping. Multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding. Get her intubated. Starting IV line. I tried to scream, to tell them I was here, aware, trapped in my unresponsive body. But nothing happened. I was a prisoner behind my own eyelids. The ambulance siren wailed, and I felt the vehicle moving, swaying. The paramedics continued working, their voices becoming my only connection to the outside world. 32-year-old female, MVA, unresponsive at scene. I'm here, I screamed silently. I can hear you. I'm still here. But they couldn't hear me. No one could. Time became meaningless. I drifted in and out, pain medication dulling my awareness, then sharpening again as it wore off. Always the voices, discussing me as if I were an interesting problem rather than a person. Diffuse axonal injury, Glasgow Coma scale. 3. Minimal brainstem reflexes. I learned I was in Mercy General's ICU, that my body was broken but would heal, that my brain showed unusual patterns of damage, that the doctors were puzzled by my condition. Not quite brain death, a female voice, Dr. Patel, I would learn, said. But not showing typical signs of minimally conscious state either. The husband's here, another voice said. David. I felt a surge of hope, of connection. He would know, somehow. He would sense I was still here. I felt a warm hand grip mine. Familiar calluses on the thumb from years of weekend tennis. Emma, he whispered, his voice breaking. Oh God, Emma. I'm here, I screamed in the void of my mind. I can hear you. Please, please notice something, anything. Dr. Patel. David's voice steadied, professional. What can you tell me? The doctor's voice was gentle, but direct. Your wife suffered severe trauma in the accident. Multiple fractures, internal injuries we've managed to stabilize. But the main concern is the brain injury. Will she wake up? His voice caught on the question. It's too early to make definitive prognoses in cases like this. Some patients with similar presentations have regained consciousness days, weeks, even years later. Years? David sounded horrified. In rare cases, yes. We need to run more tests, monitor her brain activity patterns. There's promising research on detecting covert consciousness in unresponsive patients. I felt a surge of hope. Yes, test me. Find me in here. What are her chances? David asked, his thumb absently stroking my hand. Dr. Patel hesitated. Based on the initial assessments, perhaps a 15-20% chance of meaningful recovery. But I've seen patients beat much worse odds, Mr. Wilson. The grip on my hand tightened briefly, then relaxed. I see, David said quietly. Can I have a few minutes alone with her? Of course. The nurse will be just outside if you need anything. Footsteps retreated. The door closed. I waited for David's breakdown, his pleading for me to wake up, the emotional outpouring that would confirm our love still existed beneath the recent tensions. Instead, his voice came cold and clear. Well, this is a mess. I would have flinched if I could control my body. 15 to 20%, he mused, no longer holding my hand. Not good. Odds, but not zero either. That's a problem. What are you saying? I thought desperately. I'm sorry it came to this, Emma. I really am. You were always too stubborn, too principled for your own good. He sighed. If you'd just agreed to wait on the Novartis story. My mind reeled. What was he implying? The breaks were only supposed to scare you, maybe cause a fender bender. Enough to distract you from the investigation for a while. He paused. This wasn't the plan. If I could have screamed, could have moved, could have done anything, I would have torn the room apart. My husband had sabotaged my car, had tried to hurt me to protect his precious merger, had nearly killed me. "I'll need to call Victor," David muttered, almost to himself. "He'll know how to handle this." I heard his phone beep as he dialed. "It's me," he said after a moment. "The problem is contained, but the doctor thinks there's a chance she might wake up. We need to move quickly." My soul shriveled at the coldness in his voice. This was the man I had built a life with? The man I had loved, trusted, planned a future with? "Tomorrow morning works," David continued. "Bring the paperwork we discussed. Yes, I'm sure. Just get it done." He hung up, and I felt his presence beside me again. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said, and for a moment I heard a glimpse of the man I married. "I didn't want this, but you left me no choice." The door opened. "Mr. Wilson?" A nurse's voice. "There are some forms we need you to fill out." "Of course," David said, his voice instantly transforming, grief-stricken and exhausted. "Anything to help my wife." As he left, terror gripped me. Whatever he was planning, I needed to stop it. I focused all my mental energy on moving something, anything. A finger, an eyelid. But my body remained as still as death, betraying the screaming consciousness inside. The next morning, I heard confident footsteps enter my room, accompanied by David's voice, artificially warm. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Dr. Mercer." "Of course, David. Anything for an old friend." The new voice was male, deep, with the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed. I felt cool fingers on my wrist, checking my pulse. "I've reviewed her charts," Dr. Mercer said. "Dr. Patel's assessment seems optimistic." "That's why I wanted a second opinion," David replied. "Someone I trust to be realistic." I felt the subtle emphasis on the word trust and understood with sickening clarity. This doctor was here to confirm what David wanted to hear. "Let's run through some basic tests," Mercer said. What followed was a cursory examination, checking my pupils, testing reflexes, asking for responses I couldn't give. Nothing like the thorough evaluations Dr. Patel had performed. As I suspected, Mercer finally pronounced, "Complete absence of higher brain function. Classic persistent vegetative state, likely permanent." "No!" I screamed silently. "You barely examined me. This is wrong." "So there's no hope of recovery?" David asked, his voice perfectly modulated to sound devastated while seeking confirmation. "In my professional opinion, no. The damage is too extensive. She might remain in this state for years, but Emma, the person you knew, is already gone." I raged in my mental prison. "I'm here. I'm listening to you right now." Dr. Patel mentioned something about consciousness that can't be detected through traditional means? David asked. "Theoretical research," Mercer dismissed. "Nothing with clinical validity. Some researchers desperate for funding make wild claims about covert consciousness, but the evidence doesn't support it." The door opened, and I heard Dr. Patel's voice, surprised. "Dr. Mercer? I wasn't aware another neurologist had been consulted." "Dr. Patel," David interjected smoothly. "I hope you don't mind. Victor is an old family friend, and I needed someone who understands our situation, the us." Tension in the room was palpable even to me, lying motionless. "I see," Dr. Patel said coolly. "And what conclusions has Dr. Mercer reached?" "Unfortunately, it appears to be a clear case of persistent vegetative state," Mercer replied. "No indication of meaningful recovery potential." "That's premature," Dr. Patel objected. "We haven't completed the full battery of assessments. There are promising new techniques for detecting awareness in patients previously thought unresponsive." "Those experimental protocols aren't standard care," Mercer countered. "And given Mrs. Wilson's advance directive, Dr. Patel interrupted. "I haven't seen any advance directive in her records." "I have it here," David said. Emma was very clear about not wanting extraordinary measures or to be maintained in a vegetative state. I listened in horror. I had never signed any such document. David and I had discussed end-of-life wishes in vague terms years ago, but I had never completed formal paperwork. "May I see it?" Dr. Patel asked, skepticism evident in her voice. Papers rustled. A long silence followed. "This appears to be in order," Dr. Patel finally said, her voice tight. "But I still recommend additional testing before making any decisions about Mrs. Wilson's care." "With all due respect, Doctor," Mercer said, "continuing aggressive treatment against the patient's explicitly stated wishes could be considered medical battery. Providing appropriate diagnostic testing is hardly aggressive treatment," Dr. Patel retorted. "I appreciate your dedication," David cut in, "but I need to respect Emma's wishes. She wouldn't want to exist like this." "But I do exist," I screamed into the void. "I'm here!" "Mr. Wilson," Dr. Patel said carefully. "I understand this is an incredibly difficult time, but I've seen patients recover from similar injuries. There's a new functional MRI protocol that can detect signs of consciousness, even in patients who appear completely unresponsive. At considerable expense," Mercer noted, "with questionable reliability. Is cost really the issue when we're talking about your wife's life?" Dr. Patel asked David directly. A heavy silence followed. "I think," David finally said, "we should discuss this with the ethics committee. I want to do what's right, but also what Emma would want." "I agree," Dr. Patel said, sounding relieved. "The committee can help navigate these complex decisions." "Fine," Mercer conceded, "but I'll need to present my findings as well." After they left, a strange quietness settled over my room. The regular beeps of monitors became my companions, marking time in a world where I was legally alive but considered essentially dead. Later that day, a new voice entered my awareness. Young, male, with a slight southern accent. "Afternoon, Mrs. Wilson. I'm Marcus, one of the nurse's aides. I'll be helping take care of you today." I felt gentle hands adjusting my position, checking tubes and lines. "Dr. Patel asked me to talk to you," he continued conversationally. "Says some patients can hear even if they can't respond. So I figured I'd introduce myself properly." "Thank you," I thought desperately. "Please keep talking. Please know I'm here." "Weather's nice today. Spring finally showing up after that long winter." His hands were competent, respectful as he performed necessary care. "Your husband brought some photos for your room. Nice wedding picture. You looked happy." The irony was almost too much to bear. That smiling couple in our wedding photo might as well have been strangers now. "There we go," Marcus said, finishing whatever task he was performing. "All set. I'll be back in a couple hours to turn you again. Don't go anywhere." He chuckled at his own joke, then added softly, "Sorry, that was probably in poor taste." His footsteps retreated, and I was alone again with my thoughts. Hours or days later, it was becoming hard to track time. I heard Sophia's voice, breaking with emotion. "Oh, Emma." A warm hand squeezed mine. "I came as soon as I could get a flight back." Sophia had been my best friend since college, our bond surviving her move to Chicago 3 years ago. Her familiar scent, lemon and sandalwood, washed over me as she leaned close. "David called me," she continued. He says things don't look good, but I don't believe it. You're the strongest person I know, Emma. If anyone can fight through this, it's you." "I'm trying," I wanted to tell her. "I'm fighting as hard as I can. The doctors are saying different things. That Mercer guy seems convinced you're not coming back. But Dr. Patel, she's fighting for you. And so am I." I felt tears drop onto my hand. "Something's off with David," Sophia whispered, her voice so low I barely caught it. "He's acting, I don't know, not right. Even for David." My heart leaped. Sophia sensed it too. I asked about your accident. The police report said brake failure, but when I asked if they were checking for tampering, David got defensive. Said, I was being paranoid. You're not paranoid. Listen to your instincts. Maybe I am, she sighed. Grief makes people act strangely, I guess. And it's not like David would. No, that's crazy. It's not crazy, I screamed silently. He admitted it too.
Me!
Anyway, she continued, squeezing my hand again. I'll be here all week, taking some personal days, and I'm going to make sure you get the best care possible, okay? The door opened, and David's voice cut through the room. Sophia, I heard you arrive. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. David, how are you holding up? As well as can be expected, he replied, his voice appropriately somber. The ethics committee is meeting tomorrow to discuss Emma's case. What's there to discuss? Sophia asked sharply. She needs time and treatment. It's complicated, David hedged. Emma's advance directive is pretty clear about her wishes in this situation. What advance directive? Sophia's voice sharpened further. Emma never mentioned completing one to me. A tense silence followed. It was fairly recent, David said smoothly. After her father's long illness last year, she wanted to make sure her wishes were clear, to not linger if there was no hope of recovery. My father had died of cancer 16 months ago after weeks in hospice. It was plausible that such an experience would prompt me to create an advance directive, except I hadn't. I'd like to see it, Sophia said. Of course, David replied. It's at home. I'll bring it tomorrow. More silence. I imagined them staring at each other across my bed, two people who had never quite warmed to each other now locked in silent combat. The committee will make the right decision, David finally said. For Emma. I hope so, Sophia replied, her tone making it clear she didn't trust his definition of right. After David left, Sophia leaned close again. Something's definitely wrong, she whispered. I'm going to figure out what's happening, Emma. I promise. The ethics committee meeting happened the next day. I wasn't present, obviously, but I heard about the results afterward when Dr. Patel came to my room. I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson, she said quietly, checking my vitals. The committee was divided. Dr. Mercer made a compelling case that aggressive intervention would go against your stated wishes. With your advance directive seeming clear, they're recommending minimal support moving forward. I heard the frustration in her voice. For what it's worth, I disagree, she continued. Your EEG shows unusual patterns that warrant further investigation. But without your husband's consent, she trailed off, and I felt a gentle squeeze on my arm. I'm not giving up, she said firmly. I'm requesting one final set of tests before any decisions are finalized. Dr. Mercer and your husband have agreed, if only to humor me. Hope flickered. Within my mental prison. One chance. One opportunity for technology to find me trapped in here. Later that evening, David returned. I heard him dismiss the nurse, asking for privacy. The door closed and his footsteps approached my bed. It's almost over, he said quietly. Just a few more hoops to jump through. Dr. Patel is persistent, I'll give her that. He sighed heavily. The insurance company called today. The policy has a 2-year contestability period, but given the circumstances, they're expediting the review. $4 million with the accidental death provision. My mind reeled. $4 million? My life insurance policy was supposed to be for $1 million. When had that changed? Enough to weather any fallout from the merger, David continued almost to himself. Enough to start fresh if necessary. I heard him stand, felt his presence looming over me. You should have left it alone, Em. You were always too curious for your own good. His fingers brushed my hair back from my forehead. an oddly tender gesture from the man plotting my death. "I did love you once," he said softly. "I hope you can believe that." The door opened, and someone entered. "Mr. Wilson?" A nurse's voice. "There's a call for you at the nurse's station. Something about insurance verification." "Thank you," David replied, his voice instantly transforming back to grieving husband. "I'll be right there." After he left, I lay in silent horror, the full scope of his betrayal crashing over me. It wasn't just about protecting the merger. It was about the money, about eliminating me entirely. More visitors came and went. Sophia returned, reading aloud from my favorite novel. My mother called from her missionary post in Uganda, her voice breaking over the speakerphone David held. Colleagues from the newspaper sent flowers. Through it all, I screamed silently, trapped behind my unresponsive eyes. The morning of Dr. Patel's special tests arrived. I felt myself being wheeled through the hospital, the ceiling panels passing overhead, voices discussing me clinically. "Functional MRI protocol is set up," an unfamiliar voice said. "Dr. Patel's research parameters are programmed in." "Waste of resources," I heard Dr. Mercer mutter. I was transferred to the MRI machine, sliding into the narrow tube. Instructions came through speakers. "Mrs. Wilson, if you can hear us, we're going to ask you to think about specific scenarios. First, imagine you're playing tennis. Really visualize swinging the racket, hitting the ball." "I can do this," I thought desperately, focusing all my mental energy on imagining the tennis court, the weight of the racket, the satisfaction of a clean forehand drive. Now imagine walking through your home. Visualize each room, moving from one to the next. I pictured our Victorian townhouse, mentally walking through the front door, through the living room with its bay windows, into the kitchen with the island. David and I had installed ourselves that first year. The test continued with different mental tasks. I poured everything I had into each visualization, praying the machine could detect the activity in my mind. Afterward, I was returned to my room. Hours passed with no news. Finally, I heard Dr. Patel and David enter. "The results are inconclusive," Dr. Patel said, frustration evident in her voice. "There was some activity that could indicate awareness, but the patterns weren't consistent enough to meet established criteria for covert consciousness." "So, nothing definitive," David said, relief poorly disguised as disappointment. "Not definitive, no," Dr. Patel admitted, "but enough to warrant continued observation and repeated testing." "Doctor," David said, his voice hardening slightly, "it's been nearly 2 weeks. Every specialist except you has confirmed Emma's condition is permanent. Her advance directive is clear. How long would you have her linger like this against her explicit wishes?" "Mr. Wilson, I understand your frustration," Dr. Patel replied evenly. "But rushing this decision?" "I'm not rushing anything," David interrupted. "I'm respecting my wife's autonomy and dignity, as she requested." A heavy silence fell. "The hospital's ethics committee has made their recommendation," David continued. "Unless you have clear, indisputable evidence that Emma retains consciousness, which you've just admitted you don't, I want to proceed with end-of-life protocols." "I understand," Dr. Patel said, her voice tight. "I'll make the arrangements. Standard protocol allows family members to be present for the withdrawal of life support. Would you like to schedule that for tomorrow?" "Yes," David replied. "And I'd like to spend tonight with her, saying goodbye." "Of course," Dr. Patel said softly. "I'll ensure you have privacy." After she left, David pulled a chair close to my bed. For hours, he sat silently beside me. Occasionally, visitors came, colleagues, neighbors, even my second cousin from Portland. David played the part of devastated, husband perfectly, accepting condolences with quiet dignity. When everyone had gone, leaving us alone in the darkened room, David finally spoke. "By this time tomorrow, "It will be over," he said quietly. "A tragic end to a promising life. Everyone will mourn, then gradually move on, as they should." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've made arrangements. You won't actually die tomorrow. That would raise too many questions, especially with Sophia being so suspicious. Instead, you'll be transferred to a private facility under a different name, officially deceased, but actually in long-term care, far from anyone who might recognize you." My mind raced with horrified understanding. He was going to fake my death, collect the insurance money, move on with his life while I remained trapped in my body, hidden away where no one would ever find me. "It's kinder this way," he continued. "A small chance remains that you might eventually wake up. This gives you that chance, while allowing everyone else to find closure." The twisted logic of a monster trying to justify his actions. I would have screamed if I could. "Tomorrow morning, your family and friends will gather. Dr. Mercer will supervise the withdrawal of support. You'll be pronounced dead. Then, during transport to the morgue, you'll be diverted to a private ambulance. Your new identity is already prepared." He stood, stretching. "I should get some rest. Tomorrow will be emotionally draining." He leaned down and pressed a cold kiss to my forehead. "Goodbye, Emma. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it came to this." As he left, terror consumed me. By this time tomorrow, I would be legally dead. Hidden, away and forgotten while David collected millions and built a new life on the foundation of my destruction. And there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. Tears that couldn't fall burned behind my unresponsive eyes as my family gathered around my hospital bed. My mother's hand trembled as she stroked my hair. My younger brother, Michael, stood stoically in the corner, his face a mask of disbelief. Sophia sat closest to me, her fingers intertwined with mine, as if she could anchor me to this world through sheer force of will. "It's time," Dr. Mercer said softly from the doorway. "Mr. Wilson, whenever you're ready." David nodded gravely, the picture of a devastated husband. He stepped forward to address my gathered loved ones. "Emma would be so touched to see all of you here," he said, his voice breaking at precisely the right moment. "She always said that what matters most in life are the connections we make with others." I had never said that. Not once. Dr. Patel stood silently by the monitors, her face tight with professional composure but her eyes burning with frustration. She had fought for me until the last possible moment, but hospital protocols and David's forged advance directive had tied her hands. "Before we," David paused, swallowing hard, "say our final goodbyes, does anyone want to say anything?" My mother began to pray quietly. Michael stared at the floor. Sophia leaned close to my ear. "This isn't right," she whispered, so softly only I could hear. "Something's wrong. I don't know what, but I'm going to find out, Emma, I swear it." Hope flickered dimly. Sophia knew. She couldn't prove anything, but her instincts were screaming just as mine would be in her position. One by one, they said their goodbyes. Heartfelt, devastated words that under any other circumstances would have moved me deeply. Now they only deepened my horror, knowing that everyone who loved me was being deceived into mourning me while I remained trapped within myself. Dr. Mercer stepped forward. "We'll begin by removing ventilatory support and administering comfort measures to ensure Mrs. Wilson experiences no distress." I wasn't on a ventilator. My body could breathe independently, but various supportive medications would be withdrawn. The charade would play out with me showing declining vital signs until I could be pronounced dead. "I'd like a private moment first," David requested, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. The others filed out reluctantly. When the door closed, David leaned close to my ear. "Almost there," he murmured. "The transport is arranged for midnight. Your new life awaits, Emma. Or should I say, Jane Davis?" He straightened up as the door opened again. Dr. Mercer entered with a nurse I didn't recognize, not my usual care team. "We're ready, Mr. Wilson," Dr. Mercer said. What followed was a carefully orchestrated performance. Medications were adjusted, monitors subtly manipulated. Dr. Mercer narrated my decline for the medical record, while the nurse documented everything without question. Heart rate decreasing, blood pressure dropping, respiration becoming irregular. None of it was real. I could feel my heart maintaining its steady rhythm, my lungs drawing breath normally. But the monitor beside my bed told a different story. "Time of death, 2:47 p.m., Dr. Mercer finally pronounced, his voice appropriately somber. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Wilson." David buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The nurse patted his shoulder sympathetically before turning off the monitors and drawing a sheet over my face. "I'll give you some time," Dr. Mercer said. "The mortuary transport will arrive shortly." Through the thin sheet, I heard my family return, their grief now unleashed in sobs and broken words. Each sound was a knife in my heart. They believed I was gone, that the body before them was an empty shell. If only they knew I was screaming inside, begging them to look closer, to notice something wasn't right. Time passed in a haze of helpless, rage, and despair. Eventually, everyone was ushered out so the body could be prepared for transport. The sheet was removed, and unfamiliar hands efficiently disconnected monitors and IVs. I was transferred to a different gurney and covered again. I felt movement, the gurney being wheeled through quiet corridors, an elevator. Then the cool night air as I was moved outside. I heard the metallic sound of an ambulance door opening. "This is the special transport?" a male voice asked quietly. "Yes," Dr. Mercer replied. "The paperwork shows destination as Clark Mortuary, but you'll proceed to the address I gave you." "Understood, doctor." I was loaded into the vehicle. Doors closed and the engine started. As the ambulance pulled away from the hospital, I realized with crushing finality that I had just been erased from my own life. Legally dead, soon to be mourned, memorialized, and eventually forgotten. The journey seemed endless. I had no way to track time or distance, only the rhythm of the road beneath the wheels and occasional muffled conversations from the front of the ambulance. "How long has she been under?" one voice asked. "Few weeks. Accident victim." "And the family thinks she's dead? That's cold." "Not our business. We're just the transport." Still, giving people false hope that she'll wake up someday seems cruel. The husband's paying a fortune to keep her care going. Must really love her. I would have laughed bitterly if I could. David didn't love me. He feared me. Feared what I might reveal if I ever woke up. This wasn't mercy. It was insurance. Eventually, the ambulance stopped. I was wheeled out and through automatic doors. The air smelled different, antiseptic, but with undertones of furniture polish and industrial detergent. Not the sharp clinical scent of a hospital. "Patient transfer for admission," the transport attendant announced. "Jane Davis." "We've been expecting her," a female voice replied. "Room 219 is prepared." A new journey through corridors, the squeak of the gurney wheels loud in the quiet facility. Finally stopping, being transferred carefully to a bed. Hands arranging my limbs, checking various tubes and attachments. "Poor thing," the woman said. "So young." "Chart says minimal brain activity," a male voice responded. "Persistent vegetative state. Unlikely to recover." They all say that. Yet we've had 3 wake up in the past decade. 3 out of how many? Hundreds? Still, you never know. They finished their tasks and left, switching off the lights. I lay in darkness, trying to process my new reality. I was now Jane Davis, an anonymous patient in what seemed to be a long-term care facility. My family and friends were likely planning my funeral. My husband had collected millions in insurance money, and no one except David knew I was here. Days blended into one another at Lakeside Extended Care. I learned the facility's name from the constant announcements over the PA system. I also learned the rhythms of institutionalized care, shift changes, medication times, the brief flurry of activity during physician rounds that happened only twice weekly. My primary nurse was Gabriela Santos, a woman with gentle hands and a melodious voice who always spoke to me while providing care, though she clearly didn't expect responses. "Let's get you turned, Jane," she would say, skillfully rotating my unresponsive body to prevent bed sores. "There we go. Much better, right?" Through her one-sided conversations, I learned about her 3 children, her night classes pursuing a nurse practitioner degree, her husband's job as a high school science teacher. These mundane details became treasures in my isolated existence. The doctors were less personal, making brief assessments and adjustments to my care plan before hurrying to the next patient. I was just one of many long-term cases, bodies maintained, by medical science long after most would consider life to have ended. In the endless quiet, my mind became my only refuge and my worst enemy. I developed techniques to survive the psychological torture of complete immobility with full awareness. I composed stories in my head, replayed memories in vivid detail, held imaginary conversations with my loved ones. I also found that I could retreat into a kind of mental sanctuary. Not sleep, exactly, but a deeper state of consciousness where time passed more quickly and the horror of my situation faded to a dull ache rather than searing pain. Weeks passed. No visitors came for Jane Davis, no flowers, no cards. I was a medical ghost, existing only in charts and care plans. Then one day, a new voice entered my world. "Hi there, Jane. I'm James Wilson, your new physical therapist." His voice was warm, with a hint of a southern accent. I felt strong, confident hands assessing my muscle tone. "I'm going to work with you 3 times a week. Even though you can't actively participate, passive movement helps prevent contractures and maintain circulation." Unlike the brief, perfunctory range of motion exercises the nursing staff performed, James's therapy was thorough and thoughtful. He explained each movement, each stretch, treating me like a person rather than an object. "Your muscles have good tone for someone who's been immobile this long," he commented during our first session. "Sometimes I swear I feel the slightest resistance, like you're trying to move with me." "I am," I mentally shouted. "I'm trying so hard." "That's probably just wishful thinking on my part," he continued with a self-deprecating chuckle. "But I've always believed it's better to assume patients can hear us, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. Gives me someone to talk to, at least." In the emptiness of my existence, James became my lifeline. His therapy sessions were the only time I felt truly acknowledged as a person, not just a body to be maintained. He shared stories about his dog, a golden retriever named Einstein, his passion for rock climbing, his favorite books. "Finish that novel I told you about yesterday," he said during one session, carefully stretching my left arm. The ending was disappointing. The protagonist just gave up. After everything she'd been through, all the fight she'd shown, she just surrendered. He sighed. "People don't just give up when they've fought that hard. Do they, Jane?" "No, we don't," I answered silently. "We keep fighting." As weeks turned to months, I noticed James becoming more thoughtful during our sessions. He would pause sometimes, watching me intently. "Your heart rate increases slightly when I ask you direct questions," he observed one day. "Did you know that? Just a few beats per minute, but it's consistent." I hadn't known that. Was my body betraying my consciousness in ways the monitors could detect? "I've been reading about disorders of consciousness," James continued. "The latest research suggests the line between vegetative state and minimal consciousness is much blurrier than we once thought. Some patients diagnosed as vegetative have shown brain activity patterns identical to fully conscious people when asked to imagine certain scenarios. Hope flared in my prison of silence. James was noticing, questioning, looking beyond the diagnosis. In my chart, I'm going to try something, Jane. If you can hear me, I want you to imagine playing tennis. Really visualize swinging the racket, the movement, the sound of the ball. I focused with every ounce of mental energy, picturing myself on a tennis court, serving, volleying, the satisfying thwack of the ball against the strings. Interesting, James murmured. Your breathing pattern changed slightly. Could be coincidence, of course, but I could hear the excitement in his voice. He wasn't dismissing it as coincidence. He was seeing me. During his next visit, James brought a small device with him. Portable EEG, he explained. Borrowed it from the neuro department. Not as sensitive as the hospital-grade equipment, but it might tell us something. He attached small sensors to my forehead and behind my ears. Okay, Jane. Same exercise as before. Imagine playing tennis when I count to 3. 1, 2, 3. I conjured the tennis imagery with desperate intensity, visualizing every detail. I could manage. Now stop. Relax. Now imagine walking through your home, going from room to room, starting now. I pictured my townhouse, mentally walking from the entry hall to the living room, up the stairs to the bedroom, trying to focus on every detail. That's enough, James said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. Jane, or whoever you are, I think you're in there. Yes! I screamed mentally. I'm here. I'm Emma. The patterns are crude with this equipment, but they're consistent with responsive brain activity. Not random, not reflexive. He gently removed the sensors. I need to talk to Dr. Moore about this, and I need better equipment. For the first time in months, genuine hope bloomed in my heart. Someone had found me in this prison. Someone believed I was still here. James returned 2 days later with a woman I'd never heard before. This is the patient I mentioned, Dr. Reyes, he said. Jane Davis, admitted 6 months ago following an MVA, diagnosed with persistent vegetative state. Her chart shows minimal brainstem activity, a crisp, professional female voice noted. What made you suspect covert consciousness? James detailed his observations. My heart rate changes, breathing pattern shifts, the preliminary EEG results. Intriguing, Dr. Reyes said. Definitely worth further investigation. I'm conducting a research study on precisely this phenomenon. With proper testing, we might be able to establish communication if she is indeed conscious. So you'll include her in your study? James asked eagerly. I'll need administrative approval since she's a private patient. Does she have a healthcare proxy we can contact? Just her husband, who never visits. The staff says he pays the bills but hasn't been here since she was admitted. Dr. Reyes was quiet for a moment. That complicates matters. Legally, we need consent. Let me see what I can do. The next few days were torturous. I'd come so close to breaking through my isolation, only to be thwarted by legalities and David's absent authority over my care. Finally, Dr. Reyes returned. Good news, Jane. Your husband has consented to your participation in our study via fax. We begin tomorrow. I would have wept with joy if I could. David had made a crucial mistake. He had allowed this research, probably assuming it would prove nothing and keep up the appearance of a caring husband exploring every option. Dr. Reyes's lab was different from the rest of Lakeside. The air hummed with the sound of sophisticated equipment. Voices were animated with the energy of scientific pursuit. This is our advanced EEG setup, Dr. Reyes explained as technicians attached sensors to my scalp. Much more sensitive than the portable unit James used, we'll be monitoring 128 channels of brain activity simultaneously. The testing was intensive, requiring immense mental focus. For hours, I responded to directions by thinking about different scenarios that activated distinct parts of my brain. Tennis for yes. Walking through my house for no. complex spatial navigation tasks, arithmetic problems. By the end of the first day, I was mentally exhausted but filled with hope. Dr. Reyes and her team had been increasingly excited by the readings, conferring in technical language I couldn't fully follow, but that sounded promising. Clear evidence of consistent, voluntarily modulated brain activity, Dr. Reyes summarized to James, who had stayed throughout the session. This isn't random or reflexive. Jane is responding to our questions. So she can hear us? James asked, his voice thick with emotion. She's aware? The data strongly suggests she is, Dr. Reyes confirmed. We need to run more tests to establish reliable communication, but yes, I believe Jane is conscious and cognitively intact. If I could have sobbed with relief, I would have wept until there were no tears left. After nearly 7 months of silent screaming, someone had finally heard me. The next day, Dr. Reyes began with a simple question. Jane, if you can understand me, imagine playing tennis. I visualized the tennis scene with perfect clarity, pouring all my mental energy into the image. That's a very clear positive response, Dr. Reyes said, excitement evident in her voice. Now for the crucial question. Jane, have you been aware and able to hear us all this time since your accident? Yes. God, yes. I focused on the tennis imagery again, intense and deliberate. A collective gasp went through the room. My God, someone whispered. All this time, Jane, Dr. Reyes continued, her voice carefully controlled but shaking slightly. We're going to establish a reliable communication system with you. It will take time, but we're going to find a way for you to speak to us again. Can you understand that? Tennis? Yes. The research protocol she consented to covers 2 weeks of testing. Technician reminded Dr. Reyes. We'll need to extend it, she replied firmly. This is unprecedented. The ethical implications alone. Her husband would need to approve any extension, the technician pointed out. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Dr. Reyes said, dismissively. For now, let's focus on establishing reliable communication. Over the next several days, we worked tirelessly to refine the system. Dr. Reyes and her team developed a method where I could answer increasingly complex questions through binary yes-no responses. Is your name Jane Davis? Dr. Reyes asked during one session, walking through my house. No. Do you know why you're registered under that name? Tennis? Yes. Were you given this identity against your will? Tennis. Yes. Dr. Reyes exchanged troubled glances with James, who had become a fixture at these sessions. Are you in danger? She asked carefully. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Was I in immediate danger? Probably not. But my situation was certainly dangerous. Tennis. Yes. Do you know your real name? Tennis. Yes. We're going to try something new, Dr. Reyes said. We've developed a system that might allow you to spell words. It will be slow, but it could give us more detailed information. The system involved mentally selecting letters from blocks of the alphabet shown on a screen. It was painstakingly slow and mentally exhausting, but after nearly an hour, I had spelled out Emma Wilson. Emma Wilson? James repeated, frowning. Why does that name sound familiar? Dr. Reyes was already typing on her laptop. Emma Wilson. There's a news article. Chronicle journalist dies after car accident. She looked up, her face pale. This is dated 7 months ago. James stared at the screen, then back at me. Are you saying you're Emma Wilson? That you're supposed to be dead? Tennis. Yes. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. We need to contact the authorities, someone finally said. Not yet, Dr. Reyes cautioned. We need more information. If what she's indicating is true, this is incredibly complicated, legally and ethically. Emma, was your death deliberately faked? Tennis. Yes. By whom? Your husband? Tennis. Yes. This is... James ran a hand through his hair. This is beyond anything I imagined when I noticed those first responses. Emma, Dr. Reyes said carefully, we're going to help you, but we need to be methodical. There are serious legal implications here, and we don't want to put you at further risk. Over the next several days, through the painfully slow spelling system and yes, no questions, I revealed my story, the investigation I'd been pursuing. David's reaction, the car accident, overhearing him admit to tampering with my brakes, the faked death certificate, the insurance policy. We need to find someone who knew her, James said after a particularly grueling session. Someone who can confirm her identity. She mentioned a best friend several times, Dr. Reyes noted, consulting her notes. Sophia or Sophia? Sophia, I corrected mentally, frustrated by the limitations of our communication system. I'll see if I can track her down, James offered. An Emma Wilson obituary might mention close friends. 2 days later, James returned with news. I found Sophia Andrews. She lives in Chicago, but apparently never believed the official story about Emma's death. She's flying in tomorrow. The anticipation of seeing Sophia was both exhilarating and terrifying. Would she recognize me after so many months? My body had changed, thinner, my muscles atrophied despite the therapy, my hair longer and probably different in texture. When she finally walked into the lab, I would have held my breath if I had control over such things. She approached the bed slowly, her eyes wide and uncertain. Emma? She whispered, searching my face. Is it really you? Dr. Reyes explained our communication system, and Sophia watched in wonder as I responded to questions that only Emma Wilson could answer. What did we bury in a time capsule our freshman year of college? Sophia asked, painfully slowly, letter. By letter I spelled out vodka and Sylvia Plath. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. It's her, she choked out. It's really her. No one else could know that. She grasped my hand, squeezing it tightly. Emma, I knew something was wrong. I never believed it was just an accident. David changed too quickly afterward, was too relieved. I hired a private investigator, but all trails went cold at the hospital. This is extraordinary, Dr. Reyes said. But it creates an unprecedented legal situation. Technically, Emma Wilson is legally dead. Her death certificate exists. Her assets have presumably been transferred. And the person responsible is her legal husband who, on paper, has authority over Jane Davis's medical care. We need to go to the police, Sophia insisted. We need to be careful, Dr. Reyes cautioned. If David Wilson realizes we've discovered Emma's true identity, he might take drastic action. Remember, he's already attempted to kill her once. So what do we do? James asked. We continue the research. Protocol officially, Dr. Reyes decided. That gives us 2 more weeks of authorized access to Emma. Meanwhile, Sophia, you should consult an attorney who specializes in unusual legal situations. We need to understand the implications before we make any formal accusations. Through our laborious communication system, I agreed with this approach. As much as I wanted immediate justice, rushing could put everything at risk. David had resources, connections, and a vested interest in keeping me dead. In the days that followed, Dr. Reyes's team worked feverishly to improve our communication methods. They introduced a more sophisticated brain-computer interface that allowed me to select letters faster, increasing our communication speed dramatically. Meanwhile, Sophia brought photos that confirmed my identity, including distinctive scars and birthmarks that matched medical records from before my death. David remarried, Sophia told me during one of her daily visits. Just 6 months after your death. Vanessa Sinclair, the pharmaceutical company CEO's daughter. The merger went through. He's now executive vice president of the combined company. The news should have infuriated me, but instead, it gave me a strange sense of calm. David had left evidence, connections that could be traced. His hurry to build his new life might become the key to unraveling his crimes. On my 33rd birthday, a day no one but Sophia remembered, Dr. Reyes arrived with exciting news. "We've been approved for an experimental neural implant," she announced. "It's designed for locked-in patients like you, Emma. If successful, it could allow you to communicate much more efficiently, possibly even control external devices." Surgery was scheduled for the following week. The implant would be connected to the motor cortex of my brain, potentially allowing me to bypass the damaged pathways that kept me prisoner in my own body. "There are risks," Dr. Reyes warned, "but the potential benefits are enormous." Through our communication system, I gave my emphatic consent. Any risk was worth taking if it might help me escape this silent prison and reclaim my life. The day before surgery, James visited alone. He sat beside my bed. Uncharacteristically quiet. "I don't know if this is appropriate," he finally said. "I'm still your therapist, and there are ethical boundaries. But I need you to know that He paused, struggling for words. "I've come to care for you, Emma, not just as a patient. I know the timing is terrible, and you have so much to deal with. But I wanted you to know before tomorrow, in case—" He didn't finish the sentence. If I could have smiled, I would have. In the darkness of my ordeal, this unexpected connection had been a light I hadn't anticipated. I couldn't answer him with words, but I tried to convey my feelings through the only means available, a slight change in heart rate that he had become so attuned to noticing. He smiled softly, touching my hand. "I'll be there when you wake up from surgery. We all will. Your team." As he left, I felt something I hadn't experienced in many months. Not just hope for justice or escape from my physical prison, but hope for a future beyond this nightmare. A future where I might actually live again, not just survive. The surgical preparation began early the next morning. As the anesthesia took effect, sending me into deeper darkness than even my condition had imposed, my last conscious thought was, this is not the end of my story. It's only the beginning of my return. I woke to voices, muffled at first, then gradually sharpening into clarity. The steady beep of a heart monitor, the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. For one terrifying moment, I thought I was back at the beginning, still trapped in complete immobility. My breakthrough at Lakeside just a cruel dream. "Her vital signs are stabilizing," a woman said. "Dr. Reyes, how long until we know if it worked?" That was James. "The implant needs time to integrate with the neural pathways. Days, possibly weeks before we see the full effects." I tried to signal my consciousness to somehow communicate that I was awake and listening. And then something miraculous happened. My index finger twitched. Just the smallest movement, barely perceptible, but I made it happen. "Did you see that?" James's voice was suddenly closer, excited. "Her finger moved!" "That's promising," Dr. Reyes said cautiously. "But it could be a reflex. Let's not get ahead of ourselves." It wasn't a reflex, I thought fiercely. I did that. I focused all my mental energy on repeating the movement, visualizing my finger bending on command. It twitched again, then again. "Emma, can you hear me?" James asked, his voice tight with hope. "If you can hear me, try to move your finger once for yes." I concentrated, and my finger moved deliberately. "Oh my God," he breathed. "Dr. Reyes, look." I felt a gentle pressure as someone took my hand. "Emma, this is remarkable," Dr. Reyes said. "The implant seems to be creating a bypass to your motor cortex much faster than we anticipated. Can you try to move your other fingers?" I focused on each finger in turn. My middle finger responded with a slight tremor. The others remained stubbornly still. but it was more control than I'd had in 8 months. This is just the beginning, Dr. Reyes assured me. As the neural pathways strengthen, you should regain more function. We'll start intensive therapy immediately. Over the next few days, my progress was slow but steady. Each tiny movement felt like a monumental victory. By the end of the first week, I could reliably move my right hand enough to squeeze fingers in response to questions. A far cry from normal function, but light years beyond where I'd been. Sophia arrived with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, weathered, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Emma, this is Leo Ramirez," she introduced. "Retired detective. He's been helping me investigate what happened to you." Leo pulled a chair close to my bed. "Nice to finally meet you, Ms. Wilson. Sophia has told me a lot about you." Through my limited finger movements, I acknowledged his greeting. "We've been building a case," he explained. "But carefully, very carefully. Your husband has resources and connections. If he suspects we're onto him, things could get complicated." Sophia opened a laptop. "I've been working with a legal team specializing in unusual cases. The situation is unprecedented, legally dead, but biologically alive. We're exploring options for reinstating your legal status without alerting David prematurely." Leo leaned forward. "Meanwhile, I've been looking into your accident. The police report mentioned brake failure, but didn't specify the cause. I've obtained the vehicle inspection photos through some old contacts." He showed me several pictures on a tablet. "See these marks on the brake line? That's not wear and tear. That's deliberate damage." My heart raced at the confirmation of what I already knew. David had tried to kill me. "Also been looking into the timing of events," Leo continued. "Your life insurance policy was upgraded from $1 to $4 million just 3 months before your accident. The double indemnity clause for accidental death was added at the same time." Through my rudimentary communication system, I confirmed this was done without my knowledge. "The policy was paid out remarkably quickly," Leo noted. "Usually insurers investigate thoroughly when large sums and suspicious circumstances coincide. Someone greased the wheels." "And we think we know who," Sophia added. "Victor Mercer, the neurologist who declared you brain dead, sits on the board of LifeWell Insurance's Medical Review Committee. He's also received significant research grants from David's company over the years. The pieces were falling into place, a conspiracy more extensive than I'd imagined. David hadn't acted alone." "What about my investigation?" I asked through the laborious spelling system. "Novartis trial." Sophia and Leo exchanged glances. "I found your research notes in your cloud storage," Sophia said. "Your password was still saved on my laptop from when you used it last year." She turned the screen to show me files I recognized. Interview transcripts, data spreadsheets, timelines. My investigation into Novartis Pharmaceuticals' fraudulent drug trials. "You were onto something big," Leo said, scrolling through the documents. "Clinical trial subjects dying from heart complications. Data manipulated to hide the connection to the drug. Whistleblowers silenced." "The merger between Novartis and LifeWell went through 3 months after your death," Sophia added. "David was promoted to executive VP of the combined company and given stock options worth millions." The motive became crystal clear. I hadn't just threatened David's career advancement. I'd been on the verge of exposing criminal negligence that could have torpedoed a multi-billion-dollar merger and sent executives to prison. "There's more," Leo said gravely. "I had a lab analyze your medical records from immediately after the accident. There were unusual compounds in your bloodstream, drugs not associated with emergency treatment." My skin went cold. What was he suggesting? "Specifically, a powerful muscle relaxant," he continued. "Not in doses high enough to be lethal, but enough to impair coordination and reaction time, especially if combined with alcohol." I remembered our anniversary dinner. The champagne David had insisted on ordering, though we rarely drank on weeknights. How he'd watched me drink it. "You think he drugged me before I drove?" I spelled out slowly. It's consistent with the evidence, Leo confirmed. Impair your ability to control the car, then ensure the brakes would fail at a critical moment. A carefully orchestrated accident. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. David hadn't just tried to kill me impulsively in a moment of panic. He'd planned it meticulously, calculated the risks, covered his tracks. We need to move. Carefully, Leo cautioned, building a solid case before making any moves. If David realizes you're alive and communicating, you'd be in immediate danger. There's another complication, Sophia added. David and Vanessa are planning a vow renewal ceremony for their first anniversary. It's being covered by local media because of their business prominence. If we're going to make a move, that might be the strategic moment. Maximum witnesses, public setting. I considered this. The event was still months away according to the timeline Sophia mentioned. Could I wait that long for justice? Dr. Reyes joined us, bringing news that made the decision easier. Emma, we're seeing remarkable neural integration with the implant, she reported. Your brain is forming new pathways around the damaged areas. Based on your progress, I believe you could regain significant motor function with intensive therapy. Speech might return, even walking eventually. Hope surged through me. Not just justice, but recovery. A real life reclaimed, not just legal status. How long? I asked through my finger signals. Impossible to predict exactly, she admitted. But the vow renewal ceremony Sophia mentioned. 6 months from now? It's not unreasonable to think you might be able to walk into that event with assistance, perhaps even speak. The possibility was intoxicating. To face David not as a helpless victim but as a living accusation. To see his face when I walked into that room and spoke his name. We'll need to develop a comprehensive rehabilitation plan, Dr. Reyes continued. Physical therapy, speech therapy, psychological support. It won't be easy. There will be setbacks, pain, frustration. Worth it, I signaled firmly. James, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. I've already spoken with Dr. Reyes about leading your physical therapy team, if you want me to. His eyes held a question beyond the professional offer. In the midst of this nightmare, something unexpected had grown between us. A connection forged in the unique circumstance of him finding me when I was lost to everyone else. I signaled yes, unable to express the complexity of emotions behind that simple response. Sophia squeezed my hand. We'll work on the legal and investigative angles while you focus on recovery. Leo's putting together evidence. I'm building the legal strategy. We'll be ready when you are. As they left, Dr. Reyes stayed behind. There's one more thing, Emma. Given your progress, I believe we can improve your communication while you work on recovering speech. There's a new interface for the neural implant, a virtual keyboard you can operate with your thoughts. It would allow you to type much more efficiently than our current system. Within days, the new interface was calibrated to my brain patterns. The freedom to communicate fluidly after months of silence was overwhelming. My thoughts could finally flow again, not just drip out one painstaking letter at a time. What happens when David finds out I'm in your study? I typed through the new system. He's still legally my husband and Jane Davis's guardian. The research authorization he signed gives us considerable leeway, Dr. Reyes explained. And we've been documenting everything meticulously. Your identity confirmation, your cognitive function, the evidence of what happened. If he tried to intervene now, it would immediately raise questions he doesn't want asked. Still, we agreed to maintain the official story that Jane Davis was showing promising responses to experimental treatment, but remained unidentified. A protective bubble of half-truths that would buy me time to recover more fully. The next months were the hardest physical challenge of my life. Every day brought grueling therapy sessions, small victories, and devastating setbacks. My body, dormant, for so long, rebelled against being awakened. Muscles screamed, nerves misfired. Some days I couldn't even match my previous day's achievements. James was there through all of it, professional during therapy but letting his guard down in quiet, moments between exercises. "You're the most determined person I've ever met," he told me one afternoon after a particularly difficult session. Most people would have given up by now. Most people weren't declared dead by their homicidal husbands, I typed back, my dark humor intact despite everything. He laughed, then grew serious. "Can I ask you something personal? You don't have to answer." I nodded. "Before all this, were you happy? With David?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought much about my marriage before the betrayal, too focused on survival and justice. "I thought we were happy," I typed slowly. Looking back, I see the signs I missed, the distance growing between us, his priorities shifting. I was too busy with my career to notice my marriage was dying. "It wasn't your fault," James said firmly. "Nothing justifies what he did." I know, but sometimes I wonder if I ever really knew him at all. James hesitated, then said quietly, "When this is all over, when you've reclaimed your life and David faces justice, what then? What do you want your life to look like?" "I haven't thought that far ahead," I admitted. "Freedom. Justice. Beyond that, I don't know." But his question lingered in my mind. What did I want? Who was Emma Wilson without the quest for survival and vengeance? I'd been so focused on the fight that I'd barely considered what victory might look like. Meanwhile, Leo's investigation continued to uncover disturbing connections. He discovered financial records showing David had been in severe debt before. My death, failed investments, excessive spending, mounting credit card balances. The life insurance payout had erased these problems overnight. Sophia's legal team made breakthroughs of their own, finding precedents for declaring a death certificate invalid when obtained through fraud. They prepared court filings to be submitted. When the time was right, documenting every step of my ongoing recovery and the evidence of David's crimes. Dr. Reyes recorded my neural responses to questions about my identity, creating irrefutable scientific evidence that I was the same person known as Emma Wilson, not the fictional Jane Davis. 3 months into my recovery, I achieved a milestone that reduced everyone in the room to tears. I spoke my first word aloud. "No, I," was raspy, barely audible, and came after an hour of frustrating therapy with the speech pathologist. But it was my voice, breaking through the silence that had imprisoned me for nearly a year. "Try again," the therapist encouraged, her own eyes wet. I concentrated, coordinating breath and vocal cords that had forgotten how to work together. "No," I said again, slightly clearer. James, who had been observing from the doorway, let out a laugh that was half sob. "Most people's first word is mama," he teased. "Of course yours would be no." I managed a small smile, the muscles in my face responding more readily now than they had a month ago. "Journalist," I whispered by way of explanation. "Always negative." The room erupted in laughter and applause. A small joke, but proof that my personality, myself, remained intact despite everything that had been taken from me. Progress accelerated after that breakthrough. Speech returned in halting sentences. My right arm regained enough function to operate a modified wheelchair. Supported by therapists, I could stand for short periods, then take a few faltering steps. 4 months after the neural implant surgery, I faced another milestone: surgery to address some of the physical complications. From my long immobility, scar tissue had formed around joints, limiting movement. Tendons had shortened. The procedure would release these constraints, potentially improving my mobility dramatically. "There's risk with any surgery," Dr. Reyes cautioned, "and the recovery will be painful, but without it, you'll likely always require assistance for walking." "Do it," I said, my speech still slurred but intelligible. "Want to walk into that room on my own. The room she referred to was where David and Vanessa's vow renewal ceremony would take place in 8 weeks. A luxury hotel ballroom where the city's elite would gather to celebrate the union built on my supposed death. The surgery was successful, but the recovery was excruciating. Every movement sent fire through my limbs. There were days I regretted the decision. Nights I wept, from pain and frustration. Through it all, my team supported me. Sophia brought legal updates and gossip about David's public life to distract me from the pain. Leo shared developments in the investigation, including the discovery that Dr. Mercer had not only been paid by David, but had active investments in both LifeWell and Novartis before the merger. And James. James was my rock. Professional during therapy, pushing me when I needed pushing, easing back when I needed rest. But in quiet moments, he was simply there, reading to me when my eyes were too tired from exercises, making me laugh when despair threatened to overwhelm me, holding my hand when words weren't enough. 5 months after the neural implant surgery, I stood before a mirror in my hospital room, barely recognizing the woman who stared back. My face was thinner, cheekbones more prominent. My once shoulder-length brown hair now fell in waves past my shoulder blades. No one had cut it during my time as Jane Davis. Most striking were my eyes. Harder, more intense than I remembered. The eyes of someone who had stared into the abyss and emerged transformed. "You ready?" Sophia asked, entering with a clothing bag draped over her arm. "As I'll ever be," I replied, my speech now clear though still deliberately paced. "I brought options," she said, unzipping the bag to reveal several outfits. "Wasn't sure what message you want to send for your first public appearance." I smiled at her thoughtfulness. "Something powerful, professional." We settled on a tailored navy pantsuit, with low heels I could manage with my still uncertain balance. Clothing chosen for freedom of movement as much as appearance. Leo called, "Sophia," said as she helped me dress. "Everything's in place. Police have been briefed, but they'll stay back until we give the signal. We don't want to spook David before you've had your moment." I nodded, feeling strangely calm. "The media?" "We'll be there covering the social event of the season," she confirmed, with a wry smile. The merger has made David and Vanessa quite the power couple. Their vow renewal is being featured in the society pages. "Poor Vanessa," I said, surprising myself with the genuine emotion behind the words. "I wonder if she has any idea who she really married." "Based on Leo's research, probably not," Sophia replied. "By all accounts, she's genuinely in love with him. The deception is complete. She thinks she's his second chance at happiness after tragedy." I felt a pang of sympathy for the woman who unwittingly married a would-be murderer. Whatever happened today would shatter her world too. James arrived. As we were finishing my preparations, he paused in the doorway, his expression a mix of admiration and concern. "You look," he trailed off, "different, strong." "Feel strong," I replied, testing my weight on my legs. I could stand unassisted now, walk short distances with a cane. Enough for what I needed to do today. "The car's ready whenever you are," he said. "Dr. Reyes is coming too, just in case you need medical support." I nodded gratefully. My recovery had been remarkable, but was far from complete. Today would push my limits. "Time to rise from the dead," I said, reaching for my cane. The drive to the Grand Plaza Hotel took 30 minutes. I spent it reviewing what we knew with Leo, who sat across from me in the specially arranged medical transport. "David and Vanessa arrived an hour ago," he reported. "About 50 guests are already checked in. Ceremony starts at 2, followed by a reception. Security is present but minimal, just the hotel's standard staff. They're not expecting trouble." "Any sign he suspects anything?" I asked. Leo shook his head. "None. The anonymous messages I've been sending have him jumpy, but he hasn't connected them to any threat to today's event. For weeks, Leo had been sending carefully worded messages to David, vague hints that someone knew what he'd done, designed to unsettle him without causing him to flee. The psychological warfare was meant to make him more likely to react visibly when confronted. Remember, Sophia cautioned, the goal is to expose him publicly while ensuring your safety. Say your piece, let him react, then let the authorities take over. I nodded, though a part of me longed for a more personal reckoning. But vengeance wasn't the point. Justice was. We arrived at the hotel through a service entrance, avoiding the main lobby where we might be seen. Leo had arranged access through a security contact, allowing us to navigate to a position near the ballroom without encountering the wedding party. From our vantage point in an adjacent conference room, we could hear the ceremony beginning. A string quartet played softly. Voices murmured as guests settled. "Ready?" James asked softly, standing beside me. I took his hand briefly, drawing strength from his steady presence. Ready. We waited, listening as someone introduced David and Vanessa, as they spoke about finding love again after tragedy, about the blessing of second chances. The irony was almost too much to bear. To renew these sacred vows, an officiant's voice announced. Leo checked his watch and nodded. The timing we'd planned. Maximum impact. I stood, testing my balance one final time. Sophia handed me my cane, squeezing, my shoulder in silent support. James moved to accompany me, but I shook my head slightly. This part I needed to do alone. The walk from our hiding place to the ballroom doors seemed endless. Each step required concentration, my recovered muscles still uncertain after so many months of disuse. But determination carried me forward, one step at a time. I paused at the double doors, taking a deep breath. Behind me, my team waited, ready to intervene if necessary. Ahead lay the confrontation I'd been working toward for nearly a year. I pushed the doors open and walked into the room. The ceremony was arranged in typical fashion, an aisle between seated guests, David and Vanessa at the front with the officiant. All heads turned at the sound of the doors opening, expecting a late guest perhaps, not a ghost. I moved steadily down the aisle, my cane making a soft tapping sound on the marble floor. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Who was this unfamiliar woman interrupting the ceremony? Only a few older guests showed the faintest glimmer of recognition, squinting uncertainly at my transformed appearance. David noticed the disturbance, turning from his position at the front. His expression shifted from irritation to confusion as he took in the unexpected intruder making her way toward him. I stopped halfway down the aisle, close enough to be heard clearly but maintaining a safe distance. "Before you renew these vows," I said, my voice carrying in the suddenly silent room, "I think we should address the fact that David's first wife is still very much alive." David's face went through a remarkable transformation, confusion to disbelief, to dawning horror as recognition finally hit him. "Emma?" he whispered, the color draining from his face. Vanessa looked between us, bewildered. "David, who is this woman?" "Someone who isn't supposed to be here," he managed, recovering slightly. "Security!" But no one moved. The guests were frozen in shock, and the security personnel were confused by the lack of obvious threat. "I'm Emma Wilson," I continued, addressing the room. 13 months ago, my husband tampered with my car's brakes, causing an accident that left me in a locked-in state, conscious but unable to move or communicate. He then declared me brain dead, collected $4 million in life insurance, and moved on with his life. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Camera phones emerged, recording the scene. The media representatives present moved closer, sensing a breaking story. "This is ridiculous," David sputtered, looking around desperately. "This woman is clearly mentally ill." Emma died. I watched her die. Did you? I asked calmly. Or did you arrange for me to be transferred to a private facility under a false name after declaring me dead? Did you think I wouldn't remember you? Admitting to tampering with my brakes? Or discussing the insurance payout while standing over my hospital bed? David's face contorted with rage and panic. You can't prove any of this. On cue, Sophia, Leo, and Dr. Reyes entered the room, joining me in the aisle. Actually, Sophia said, raising her voice, we have extensive evidence. Medical records proving continuous biological life despite a death certificate. Brain scans, documenting consciousness during the period you claimed she was brain dead. Financial transactions showing your debt before her death and sudden affluence after. And my personal favorite, Leo added, the brake line from Emma's car showing tool marks consistent with deliberate tampering, preserved by the insurance. Investigators who apparently weren't as easily bought as Dr. Mercer. David's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal's. Vanessa had backed away from him, her face a mask of horror and dawning comprehension. Is this true? She whispered. David, tell me this isn't true. Instead of answering her, he lunged toward me, desperation overriding reason. You ruined everything, he snarled. I stood my ground, though my heart raced. Before he could reach me, James appeared at my side, placing himself between us. Security personnel finally moved in, restraining David as he struggled and shouted, "You were going to expose the trials!" David yelled, incriminating himself further in his rage. The merger would have collapsed, everything I'd worked for. Police officers entered then, responding to the prearranged signal. As they took David into custody, reading him his rights, I felt a strange emptiness where I expected triumph. The moment I'd fought so hard to reach had arrived, but it brought no joy, only relief that a dangerous chapter was ending. Vanessa approached me cautiously, her face tear-streaked but composed. I didn't know, she said simply. I swear to you I didn't know. I believe you, I replied gently. You're a victim in this too. As the police led David away, still shouting accusations and denials, I felt my strength finally beginning to fade. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation ebbed, leaving exhaustion in its wake. James was instantly at my side, supporting me. Let's get you out of here, he murmured. As we turned to leave, an elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd. Emma Wilson, she said, her voice quavering. The journalist. I remember your byline. You were investigating clinical trials at Novartis, weren't you? I nodded, surprised. My son died in those trials, she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Heart failure, they said. Natural causes. But I never believed it. Understanding dawned. David hadn't just tried to kill me to protect his career or secure a lucrative merger. He'd tried to silence the truth about lives lost to corporate greed. Have all my research, I told her. Every document, every interview. When this is over, I'll finish the story. I promise. She nodded once, squeezing my hand before stepping back. As we made our way out of the ballroom, surrounded by my team, I realized I'd found the answer to James's question about what I wanted after justice was served. Not just to reclaim my old life, but to use my second chance to finish what I'd started. To give voice to those who, unlike me, would never get the opportunity to speak again. Outside in the bright afternoon sun, leaning on James for support, I took my first free breath in over a year. The road ahead would be challenging. Physical recovery, legal battles, rebuilding a life declared over. But I was Emma Wilson. I had fought my way back from death itself. Whatever came next, I would face it standing on my own 2 feet, surrounded by the people who had helped me find my voice again. Camera flashes erupted around us as we left the hotel. Reporters who had been covering the high society vow renewal suddenly found themselves in the middle of a much bigger story. They shouted questions, thrusting microphones toward me as James and Sophia helped me navigate through the crowd. Ms. Wilson, how did you survive? Were you conscious the whole time? Did you know your husband was trying to kill you? Leo stepped in, his authoritative presence creating a buffer. Ms. Wilson will not be answering questions at this time. A formal statement will be issued through her attorney. We made it to our waiting car, where Dr. Reyes was already preparing a mild sedative. Your heart rate is elevated, she said with concern. This has been an enormous strain. You need rest. I shook my head, though exhaustion pulled at every limb. Not yet. Need to see it through. The police have him in custody, Sophia assured me. He's not going anywhere. I want to hear him charged, I insisted. Want to see it? James and Dr. Reyes exchanged concerned glances, but Sophia understood. After everything David had taken from me, I needed to witness this part of justice being served. We can arrange that, Leo said. I know the detective in charge. But first, you need to give a formal statement. At the police station, I was treated with a mixture of awe and careful professionalism. Detective Morgan, a sharp-eyed woman with prematurely gray hair, conducted my interview personally. I've been a detective for 23 years, she said, shaking her head as she set up the recording equipment. Never had a case quite like this. For the next 2 hours, I recounted everything. The investigation I'd been pursuing, David's reaction, the accident, overhearing his confession about tampering with my brakes, the faked death certificate, the facility where I'd been hidden away, and my gradual recovery. Detective Morgan took meticulous notes, occasionally stopping me to clarify details. And you were conscious throughout? She asked, clear disbelief in her voice despite her professional demeanor. Every moment, I confirmed. Couldn't move, couldn't speak, but heard and felt everything. She shuddered slightly. I don't have words for what that is. Torture, I said simply. It was torture. After completing my statement, I was allowed to observe David's initial interrogation through a one-way glass. He sat at a metal table, his expensive suit rumpled, his face ashen. The confident executive was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. Your wife is alive, Mr. Wilson, Detective Morgan stated flatly as she entered the room. And she remembers everything, including your admission to tampering with her brakes. That's impossible, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Emma died. I saw the death certificate. The death certificate you arranged through your associate, Dr. Mercer? The same Dr. Mercer who's currently being questioned in another room? She slid a folder across the table. We have the transfer orders showing Emma Wilson being transported to Lakeside Extended Care under the name Jane Davis. We have the payment records from your account to the facility. We have the forged advance directive. David's lawyer, a sleek man in an even more expensive suit than David's, leaned forward. My client has no comment at this time. But David wasn't listening to his attorney. His carefully constructed world was collapsing, and with it, his composure. You don't understand, he blurted. She was going to ruin everything. The merger, my career, everything. Mr. Wilson, I advise you to remain silent, his lawyer hissed. She found the trial data, David continued, ignoring him. Patients dying in the Phase 3 trials for Cardioxal. Data buried. If that had come out before the FDA approval, before the merger. He ran his hands through his hair. Billions of dollars. Thousands of jobs. My future. All gone because she couldn't let it go. Detective Morgan sat back, letting him implicate himself further. It wasn't supposed to be fatal, he insisted, a hint of his old arrogance returning. Just enough damage to scare her, maybe cause minor injuries. Distract her from the investigation until after the merger. But when the accident was worse than expected, I saw an opportunity. An opportunity to collect $4 million in life insurance? Detective Morgan suggested. That was just a bonus. David said dismissively. The real value was in the merger. The stock options alone were worth 10 times that amount. His lawyer stood up. This interview is over. My client is clearly under duress and not thinking clearly. But the damage was done. David had admitted to criminal intent, to arranging the brake failure, to financial motive. Combined with the physical evidence and my testimony, it was more than enough for the prosecutor to file charges. I turned away from the glass, a strange emptiness replacing the vindication I'd expected to feel. David's confession should have been satisfying, but it only highlighted the cold calculation behind his betrayal. Not a crime of passion, but a business decision. I had been an obstacle to be removed, nothing more. "Are you okay?" James asked, his hand warm on my shoulder. "Not really," I admitted, "but I will be." The next few days passed in a blur of medical examinations, legal consultations, and media frenzy. My story had captured national attention. The journalist left for dead, conscious through her own funeral, returning to expose her husband's crimes. News vans camped outside the hospital where I'd been transferred for observation after the confrontation. Sophia handled the media expertly, issuing limited statements while shielding me from unwanted intrusion. "Focus on healing," she insisted. "The story can wait." But some parts couldn't wait. 3 days after David's arrest, a judge held an emergency hearing to address my unique legal status. I sat in the courtroom, supported by Dr. Reyes and a medical team, as attorneys argued over whether I was legally alive or dead. "Your Honor, the death certificate was obtained through fraud," Sophia argued. "The documentation clearly shows Ms. Wilson has been biologically alive continuously since her accident." The judge, an older woman with shrewd eyes, reviewed the medical records carefully. "In my 30 years on the bench, I've never encountered a case quite like this," she said, echoing Detective Morgan's sentiment. "However, the law is clear about death certificates procured through fraudulent means." She ruled in my favor, officially rescinding my death certificate and restoring my legal status. It was a surreal experience, being legally resurrected through judicial order. "There remains the question of assets distributed upon Ms. Wilson's presumed death," the judge continued. "Those matters will require separate proceedings, given the complexity involved. In other words, reclaiming my financial life would be a long battle." The insurance company that had paid the policy was already filing motions to recover the money from David's frozen assets. My modest retirement accounts, our joint property, even my personal belongings. All would need to be legally untangled. Outside the courthouse, I faced reporters for the first time, standing with James's support on one side and Sophia on the other. "I'm grateful for the court's recognition of the truth," I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "But legal status is just the beginning. There are still many questions to be answered. About my case, and about the clinical trial data I was investigating before my accident." A reporter called out, "Will you continue that investigation?" I nodded firmly. "More determined than ever. People died in those trials. Their families deserve the truth, just as I did." As we left, an unexpected figure approached. Vanessa Sinclair, David's second wife. The crowd of reporters surged forward, sensing drama, but Leo and his security team created a barrier. "Can we speak privately?" she asked, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. We found a quiet conference room inside the courthouse. Vanessa sat across from me, her elegant hands clasped tightly on the table. "I want you to know I had no idea," she began, "about any of it. The accident, the fraud, the clinical trials. My father kept me insulated from the business operations." She looked down. "I've spent the past 3 days wondering if that was deliberate, if I was just another pawn in their game." "I believe you," I said. And I did. The shock and horror on her face at the ceremony had been genuine. "I've turned over everything I could find from David's home office to the investigators," she continued. "And I've resigned from the board of directors Whatever happens with the company now, I won't benefit from it. That's honorable, I said, somewhat surprised. It's the least I can do. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. The marriage will be annulled, of course. Legally, it never existed since he was still married to you. A bitter smile crossed her face. Small comfort. None of this is your fault, I said gently. No, but I'm complicit in my ignorance. I never questioned the merger, the sudden wealth, the convenient timing. She stood, smoothing her skirt. I'm sorry for what happened. To you. And I promise, if I learn anything else that might help your case, either against David or regarding the clinical trials, you'll be the first to know. As she left, I felt a strange kinship with this woman who had unknowingly shared my husband. We had both been deceived by David Wilson, though in vastly different ways. That evening, exhausted from the day's events, I sat in my hospital room reviewing the latest medical reports with Dr. Reyes. Your recovery continues to exceed expectations, she said, genuine wonder in her voice. The neural pathways are strengthening daily. With continued therapy, you could regain up to 80% of your former functionality. And the other 20%? I asked. She smiled sadly. Medicine still has its limitations. Some nerve damage is permanent. But given where you started, what was done to you, what you've achieved is nothing short of miraculous. James entered with a tablet in hand. Thought you might want to see this, he said, queuing up a news video. It was coverage of Dr. Mercer being led from his office in handcuffs, FBI agents, carrying boxes of documents behind him. The investigation has expanded, James explained. The FBI's healthcare fraud division is now involved. They're looking into the connection between Mercer, David, and the clinical trials you were investigating. Good, I said firmly. It was never just about what David did to me. It was about all of it. The corruption, the cover-ups, the lives lost for corporate profit. As James set the tablet aside, his hand brushed mine. The contact sent a now familiar warmth through me. In the midst of legal battles and medical challenges, something unexpected had bloomed between us. Neither of us had acknowledged it openly. The timing was impossible, the circumstances extraordinary, but it existed nonetheless. I should let you rest, he said, reluctantly pulling away. Stay, I replied simply. Just for a while. He settled into the chair beside my bed, and we sat in comfortable silence as night fell outside my window. Whatever lay ahead, I knew I wouldn't face it alone. Spring sunlight streamed through the courtroom windows as I took the witness stand. 9 months had passed since my dramatic return from the dead. 9 months of physical therapy, legal proceedings, and gradually reclaiming my life. Please state your name for the record, the prosecutor requested. Emma Wilson, I replied, my voice clear and strong. The speech therapy had paid off. Only those who knew me well could detect the slight hesitation between certain words. Ms. Wilson, can you tell the court about the events leading up to your accident on April 15th of last year? For the next hour, I testified about my investigation into Novartis Pharmaceuticals' clinical trials, about discovering evidence of data manipulation and patient deaths, about David's increasingly desperate attempts to dissuade me from publishing my findings. David sat at the defense table, almost unrecognizable from the powerful executive he'd once been. Jail time had leached the arrogance from his posture, avoided my gaze as I described hearing him admit to tampering with my brakes, to orchestrating my death. And during this entire period, nearly 8 months, you were conscious but unable to communicate? The prosecutor asked. Yes, I confirmed. Doctors call it locked-in syndrome with covert consciousness. I could hear, feel, and think, but couldn't move or speak. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The horror of my experience never failed to affect people viscerally. No further questions, the prosecutor said. David's attorney approached for cross-examination. He was fighting a losing battle. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, but was obligated to create whatever doubt he could. Ms. Wilson, you've testified that you heard my client make incriminating statements while you were in this locked-in state. But isn't it possible, given your medical condition, that you were experiencing auditory hallucinations? The brain scans performed by Dr. Reyes confirmed my consciousness during that period, I replied calmly. Additionally, the timeline and details I recalled align perfectly with hospital visitor logs and recorded conversations. There were no hallucinations. He tried several other approaches, suggesting my memory might be impaired, questioning the timeline, even implying that my desire for revenge might have colored my recollection. None gained traction against the mountain of corroborating evidence. When I was finally excused from the stand, I walked slowly but unassisted back to my seat. A small victory, but one that mattered to me. I had testified against the man who tried to erase me from existence, and I had done it standing on my own 2 feet. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Other witnesses included Dr. Patel, who had suspected my consciousness from the beginning, Marcus, the nurse's aide who had spoken to me as if I could hear, Dr. Reyes, who explained the science behind detecting covert consciousness, and numerous experts on the physical evidence of brake tampering and financial motive. The most damaging testimony, however, came from Dr. Mercer. Facing his own charges for insurance fraud, falsifying medical records, and conspiracy, he had accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony against David. Mr. Wilson approached me approximately 3 weeks before Mrs. Wilson's accident, Mercer testified. He expressed concerns about her mental health, suggesting she might be becoming paranoid about her investigations. He wanted me prepared to intervene if necessary. And after the accident? The prosecutor asked. He called me directly, bypassing normal protocols. He said her prognosis was poor, and that she had an advance directive requesting no extraordinary measures. I facilitated the process. Did you examine Mrs. Wilson thoroughly before declaring her brain dead? Mercer hesitated. No. I performed only cursory tests. I knew what result Mr. Wilson wanted. And you provided that result in exchange for research funding from his company? Yes, Mercer admitted, unable to meet anyone's eyes. And a guaranteed position on the medical board of the merged companies. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Attempted murder, insurance fraud, conspiracy, identity fraud. David Wilson was sentenced to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 18 years. I watched him being led away in handcuffs, searching my heart for the vindication I'd expected to feel. Instead, I found only a quiet resolve to move forward. David had tried to end my story. My greatest victory was continuing to write it. Outside the courthouse, Sophia handled the media while I slipped away with James to a quiet cafe we'd discovered during the trial. The owner, a kind woman named Margaret, who had followed my case obsessively, always kept a secluded table for us away from windows and curious eyes. "How are you feeling?" James asked, once we were settled with coffee. "Lighter," I decided after a moment. "Like I've set down something heavy I've been carrying for too long." He reached across the table to take my hand. The gesture had become familiar over the months, comfort evolving into affection, then something deeper neither of us had named yet. "What happens now?" he asked. "With the pharmaceutical investigation, I mean." I smiled at his careful specification. We both knew there were other, more personal questions hovering between us, but those would wait for the right time. "The FBI's case is proceeding," I said. "With Mercer's testimony and the documents, Vanessa, provided they have enough to go after the senior executives at both companies. The cardioxyl drug has been pulled from the market pending review." "And your story? The one you were working on before all this happened?" "Almost ready to publish," I confirmed. "The Chronicle has given me all the space and resources I need. It's larger than my original investigation. It's about systemic failures in drug testing, regulatory capture at the FDA, the human cost of rushing medications to market. You never stopped being a journalist, did you? Even when you couldn't write, you were gathering information, observing, making connections. It kept me sane, I admitted, focusing on the story instead of my situation. Somewhere around month 3 as Jane Davis, I started mentally composing paragraphs, structuring arguments, planning the article I'd write if I ever got the chance. James smiled, the expression lighting his eyes in a way that still made my heart skip. And now you have that chance. Because of you, I said softly. You saw me when no one else did. A comfortable silence fell between us, filled with unspoken possibilities. We had agreed to wait until after the trial, until David was sentenced, before exploring what was growing between us. Now that moment had arrived, and I found myself suddenly nervous. James seemed to sense my thoughts. One day at a time, he said gently. No rush. I squeezed his hand gratefully. I'd like that. 2 months later, my byline appeared on the front page of the Chronicle for the first time since my death. The headline read, Fatal Trials, How Pharmaceutical Giants Bury Data and Endanger Lives. The comprehensive investigation used the Novartis case as a launching point to explore broader issues in drug development and approval. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Congressional hearings were announced. Class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of patients harmed by Cardioxal. The FDA commissioner faced calls for resignation. In the midst of the media storm, I received an unexpected visitor at my new apartment. Amy Richardson, the elderly woman who had approached me at David's vow renewal ceremony, whose son had died in the Novartis trials. I had to come thank you in person, she said, settling onto my couch with the careful movements of someone managing chronic pain. After Richard died, no one would listen. The doctors, the company, even his friends, they all accepted the story that his heart failure was unrelated to the drug. I nodded, understanding her frustration. The system is designed to make questioning difficult. Your article changed that, she said, pulling a worn newspaper from her bag, my front page story, carefully preserved. Now everyone's listening. The company called yesterday, wanting to discuss a settlement. Are you going to accept? I asked. She smiled grimly. Not until after I testify at the congressional hearings. Some things are more important than money. Her visit reinforced what I had come to realize during my recovery, that justice wasn't just about David facing consequences for what he'd done, to me. It was about all the Richard Richardsons whose stories had been buried, whose deaths had been dismissed as statistical anomalies rather than evidence of corporate malfeasance. That evening, I met Sophia and James for dinner to celebrate the article's publication. We gathered at a small restaurant where the owner knew us well enough to ensure privacy. To the triumphant return of Emma Wilson, journalist, Sophia toasted, raising her glass. And to the people who made it possible, I added, looking at my 2 closest supporters. After dinner, James walked me home, his hand warm in mine despite the autumn chill. We had been taking things slowly, both aware of the extraordinary circumstances that had brought us together and the healing I still needed to do, both physically and emotionally. I have something for you, he said, as we reached my door. He pulled a small wrapped package from his pocket. A publication gift. Inside was a key on a simple silver chain. It's to my cabin up at Lake Morton, he explained. I thought maybe this weekend, if you're feeling up to it, we could go up there, just to get away from everything for a couple of days. The invitation was clearly about more than just a weekend getaway. It was about possibilities, about writing a new chapter. I'd like that very much, I said, feeling a flutter of anticipation that had nothing to do with anxiety for once. Later that week, while packing for the trip, I came across a folder I hadn't opened since my return. photographs from my funeral. Sophia had reluctantly shared them when I insisted on seeing what David had arranged. The images were surreal. Flowers I would never have chosen. David accepting condolences with perfect grieving husband composure, friends and family genuinely devastated by my supposed death. I closed the folder and returned it to the drawer. That chapter was over. David was in prison, his corporate conspirators, facing justice, the truth about the clinical trials exposed. And I was here, scarred but stronger, changed but not destroyed. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman I was still getting to know, thinner than before, with new lines at the corners of my eyes, hair now streaked with a few strands of premature gray. But my eyes held a clarity and purpose that hadn't been there before. Dr. Reyes had called my recovery miraculous, but the true miracle wasn't just regaining physical function. It was finding meaning in what had happened, purpose in my second chance. The next morning, I packed my bag for the weekend at the lake. As I prepared to leave, my phone rang. A colleague at the Chronicle with news about the congressional hearings. "They, sir, want you to testify as the lead witness," she explained. "Your experience gives you credibility no other journalist would have." I agreed immediately, already mentally composing my testimony. The work continued, and that felt right. My story, like the truth I had fought to expose, refused to be buried. When James arrived to pick me up, his smile was like sunshine after a long winter. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them standing on my own 2 feet. My voice, restored, surrounded by people who had seen me when I was invisible. I was Emma Wilson, the woman who came back from the dead to reclaim her life and her voice. And my story was far from over. What would you do if you were erased from your own life, left conscious but unable to reach out? Would you find the strength to fight back from the edge of existence? Emma's journey reminds us that even in our darkest moments, hope can survive. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more tales of resilience, justice, and second chances at life.